Hello, everyone, and welcome to our training today on managing resources in response to mass violence incidents. Today, the presenters are myself, Krista Flanagan, and I'll be joined by Jeff Dion. And I'll turn over to Jeff now if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself, and we'll get into the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Krista. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Dion. I'm the Executive Director of the National Compassion Fund, and we collect and distribute charitable donations in the aftermath of mass casualty crimes. Since 2014, we have administered 20 funds, and I'm happy to share the things I've learned with you along the way.
Hi, like I said before, I'm Krista Flanagan, and I'm a consultant with ICP TTA, and I also teach at Florida State University in the College of Criminology and Criminal Justice. I've had extensive experience over the last 25 years responding to various incidents of mass violence and terrorism, and have been recently working with the Office of Victims of Crime related to helping communities plan and prepare to work with victims following incidents of mass violence and terrorism. So let's begin our training today. Okay, we are here, as I said, as a part of the ICP TTA project, and ICP stands for Improving Community Preparedness. And this project has relied on the expertise of people who have been on the ground and who have been doing the work. That the idea is for this project is to work with communities in establishing plans that will augment, enhance their existing emergency response plans. So the intention is not to replace anything that has been done. So the idea is to ensure that victims, families, and first responders care after incidents of mass violence and terrorism, as well as domestic terrorism and international terrorism. It also is available to provide individualized training and technical assistance for selected communities. We will have a QR code for you at the end of this presentation if you are interested in a community, being a community to receive the technical assistance to help you put together a plan, and you will be assigned a consultant. And also there are subject matter experts available for training similar to the training that we will be providing you today. So part of the vision for ICP is to adopt a victim response plan for criminal mass violence and domestic terrorism that's realistic, that's accessible, and that you can actually use and that you can exercise. And it's important that you incorporate victim care protocols into the existing exercise structure and calendar. That's important that victim services is incorporated into what's already in place. And also to be looking at existing response plans and recognizing that they don't account for the care of victims at the scale and scope that is needed. So it's an idea as the bridge between tactical operations and victim care, and really it's a larger task than handing it off just to victim services within a particular agency. It's more of incorporating them into the plans, and also recognizing that community-based and victim services agencies really don't understand the incident command structure. That's not a part of what they do, and where they fit in and how they function effectively within that system. And this often results in chaos or a duplication of effort. So this project is really to try to bridge those barriers. And part of the planning for incidents of mass violence and domestic terrorism is to put in place these best practices for planning. And there are 16 components that are recommended through ICP, and these are here for you. And that individual training can be applied for this as far as consulting, but also just looking at each of these components, because the plan is very comprehensive, as you can see. And any one of these can be looked at individually, but it's really recommended that even if they are done individually, that they all be put into a comprehensive plan. So the idea of a comprehensive victim services plan is that it be collaborative. I want to say a few words about collaboration. So a comprehensive victim response plan has to be collaborative. And we use the term collaboration quite frequently, and many not really knowing what true collaboration is. And what collaboration really means is working for the mutual benefit of each other for a common goal. And in with our frame of reference and discussion today, our common goal is providing comprehensive victim services, and especially specific to resource management. But the plan has to be looking at what benefits both, all agencies that are involved, a mutual benefit. And it needs to be multidisciplinary. And each of those disciplines are going to have to be valued and recognized. And a lot of, when we look at a comprehensive plan, because you saw those 16 best practices, there's no way that one agency or a couple of agencies or traditional response agencies can do everything. And so it's going to be bringing in some of the non-traditional partners. And so it's recognizing the value that everybody brings to the table, and respecting that and honoring that. And also to remain victim focused through the whole planning process. And we'll be talking about that today as we are discussing resource management, because it's about resourcing, it's about managing resources for victims. Which takes us to our goal of today's webinar, is to identify the various aspects of resource management, including goods, services, and financial resources, in order to create community plans that include equitable collection, management, and distribution of resources. So when we are talking about managing resources, we first need to discuss why there are so many resources to manage. Americans are among the most generous people in the world. On the whole, when they see there's a problem, they want to help. Now, often they go into it blindly, but usually it's with the best intentions. And also, like individuals, communities also react to trauma. We know that communities go through an experience of crisis and shock, kind of denial that something has happened, that there is a time where the community is mourning. And this is where we see maybe if there's been mass fatalities, that there are multiple funerals and there are public memorial services. We see communities that experience as a whole anger at what has happened. And it, of course, can be anger at the perpetrator, but it could be anger at the responders. It could be anger at local government. It could be anger at citizens. Depends on what the incident is. And of course, then there's fear that this can happen in their community and that it will happen again. And communities go through sort of what we call a honeymoon period, because people are really coming together and joining together, and we see a lot of heroes that are acknowledged for the wonderful work that they do. But what happens though after a period of time, and it can happen pretty quickly, really, within the first couple of weeks, that communities might start to experience some conflict because they're disillusioned about where they feel that they should be kind of in their healing process and their recovery process, and also kind of disillusioned about the fact that everybody had come together so nicely in those early days, but now all of a sudden the conflict is back because, let's face it, there was probably conflict amongst agencies and within the community prior to an incident, and after an incident of mass violence and terrorism occurs, that it can just become exacerbated. And so as a result of this, that a community is going to be vicariously traumatized. So what is vicarious trauma? Well, really quickly, what it means is it's not direct trauma that a person experiences. So what it's sort of the residual of exposure of another person's trauma. And when we see about with all of the media coverage of incidents, that people can really saturate themselves in getting information about incidents. And if it's happened in their community, it is very close and personal to them. And so what we see that people do as a result of this is that there's usually an outpouring of emotions, goods and services, and money. And really, action is taken to alleviate this helplessness, and it helps them take control and kind of make a sense of the tragedy. And then ultimately, like what we see with communities is there's an integration of the experience, that they don't identify themselves as the community that had whatever particular incident that occurred, but it's something that has happened within their communities that has hopefully helped them become more resilient. So, what is resource management? Well, what's included and what we're going to be talking about today are funds, goods, and services. So, resource management is a complex and challenging process that includes organization, containment, and disbursement of funds, goods, and services that is been received by the public in response to incidents of mass violence or terrorism. This complex process can be managed effectively if it's planned for in advance of an event, and that's what we are recommending for you in today's presentation. Resource management and disbursements can be one of the most challenging aspects of response and recovery. If there's no plan or if not managed well, donations of goods, services, and funds can actually impede the immediate response and add a burden to the response planning and implementation process. Not everyone in the community is going to agree on the final resource management strategy, and you have to keep your entire community's needs in mind. Lessons learned from previous mass violence and terrorism incidents consistently underscore that response and recovery efforts are much more effective when when the organizational roles are defined prior to an incident, when the pre-established relationships that are a part of the planning process, that they create a more efficient response and faster recovery. And also that a planned and uniformed resource management strategy can actually mitigate the burden and allow for a much more comprehensive and efficient process of the disbursement, focusing on the most immediate or extensive needs. Now, since financial donations can be the most challenging to manage, we're going to be spending the bulk of our time discussing that particular resource. And Jeff is going to begin by talking about how to develop a management plan for financial donations.
Thanks, Krista. There are so many issues to consider when you're dealing with financial donations, and if tackling these ahead of time are going to make it so much easier to respond after an event and allow you to help survivors sooner. In the 20 incidents that we've responded to, not one of those communities had a plan in place to deal with these donations. And so it really meant they were responding in sort of that fog of crisis. And it's not the best time to try and make new relationships or create new structures. So if you can think about this ahead of time and put a plan in place, then once an incident happens, you can implement that plan, hopefully after it's been drilled and exercised. And so there's a lot of things to consider. The first is the structure of your distribution process. What are you going to be covering for victims and survivors? Thinking about things that are already covered by crime victim compensation. Are you going to be filling a gap to address things that aren't covered by comp? So that's what you want to think about ahead of time. Also, communications and developing a media and social media plan is very important to keep people informed. You want to keep victims and survivors informed about what's the process and where do they go to get help. You want to keep the community informed about when people want to donate. And as Krista pointed out, oftentimes that organic need, that feeling of powerlessness where people want to help, and that oftentimes manifests itself through donating money, you want to let them know where's the right place to donate and how. You also want to identify the primary agency that's going to be developing a process for managing those donations, whether it's funds or goods or services, and also keeping in mind that it might not be the same agency that oversees each of those. For instance, with the National Compassion Fund, we manage donated funds, but we don't do services, though we do work in close collaboration with victim services and the folks on the ground responding to that. And so it's important to identify who's going to be doing what. And I think one of the first questions to making those identifications is to figure out who has the expertise in each of those particular functions, and then recognizing the need for all of these stakeholders and responders to work together collaboratively. You also want to think about donors and where is this money going to come from? Sometimes it will just come in donations from the general public, but oftentimes in the aftermath of an event like this, corporations will want to step up and show that they're helping. In my experience, corporations tend to give the most amount of money, but sometimes they also take the longest to give. And so it's helpful to think about it within your community, who are the likely corporate donors? Who are the corporations that are major employers in the area, whether it's your local sports franchise or other people that might be a good corporate donor to think about ahead of time. And also, you want to anticipate both victim needs and community needs. I tell every community there are numerous legitimate needs that arise out of an event of mass violence. Some people might want to build a memorial. Some people might want to have help that goes directly to individual victims. Some people might want to help support community mental health response and building community resiliency. All of those are absolutely legitimate. But because those needs are differing, sometimes it is easiest if you think about that up front and let donors basically vote with their mouse. If you want to give money to a memorial, donate here. If you want to give money to help victims, click here. If you want to give money to help community needs, donate here. So that way you can avoid the issues of people complaining that you haven't been true to donor intent. And as you're thinking about this, you want to consider whether you're going to be making a direct allocation to victims and survivors, or whether it's just going to be money that goes to community groups to provide services in response to the event. No right or wrong answer, but you want to think about the method that you're going to use ahead of time. And it's really important that you have people who are both good managers and trauma informed. So because when you're going to deal with survivors, you want to make sure we're not going to do anything to re-victimize them. And so we always look at who are the people that are going to be victim facing and directly interacting with victims. We might have people that have some technical skills that we need, but might not have the victim services background that we want to have working with survivors. And so we think about those roles carefully to make sure we put the right people in those public-facing positions. And you also want to develop a reporting and organizational structure that's going to provide clearly defined roles. Having transparency is incredibly important to building public trust. And I think one of the reasons to do this as a community is to help combat incidents of fraud. And so the more transparent you can be, the greater the likelihood that you can instill confidence in the community and survivors and donors in the process that you're using. Now, everyone needs to recognize that they're a stakeholder in this plan, and the plan should really be drilled and exercised and updated at the same time as a law enforcement drill. Because we know that when you're dealing with real victims, you don't get the same response as if you're doing a live action drill and you've got a person who has a piece of paper taped to their chest that says victim. Because we know in reality, you'll have, for every victim that's impacted, you could have 10 family members or bystanders show up on site. And how are you going to be dealing with those folks? And you want to make sure that you have a good victim services response in place. And so when you're planning for a donation management plan, you want to include all of the possible stakeholders. You don't want a plan that's going to exist independently aside from the emergency management response. You want it to be integrated into the whole process so that everybody knows what everyone else is doing. Now, another issue is the language that you're going to use. Initially, many of these funds were called victims funds, but people have different ways of defining victims. Some say if you say that you're helping victims, that may cause some people to say, well, I'm the victim of this crime, they're not, and so that money is for me. If you say that you're helping survivors, not only is that a better term generally to use and more affirming term, but you can also define that as helping people who were injured and survived, people who were traumatized and survived, and the surviving family members of those who were killed. So using the term survivor, which has a broader definition, can help you up front. Time after time, I've seen communities put up information in those early hours and say, this is what the money's going to go for, only to have to go back later and retool it. And so if you can have consistent messaging from the very beginning, it's going to help you, but you have to think about what that messaging is going to be, and thinking about that prior to the event will be particularly helpful. It's also important to leverage the full range of constituencies and skill sets that are available in your community. Certainly, you want to work with your VOCA and crime victim compensation administrators for them to know what you're doing and how does it interact with what they're doing. I've had very good relationships with compensation administrators who have shared information. I know when we were doing Las Vegas, and we were just sort of unsure about what's the universe of people that are going to be looking to us for a response. And we were able to talk to crime victim compensation and get a sense of how many applications they had received and they were processing, which really was a good barometer of the size of universe that we are going to be dealing with. You want to look to the philanthropic agencies in your community. We've done a lot of work with community foundations. Community foundations can be very helpful in collecting money because they also know who those regular corporate donors are, but they're not victim service agencies, and they'll need your help to be able to respond to this, but they play an important role. Also, government agencies. We often look to law enforcement and prosecutors' offices, not just for coordinating victim services, but also sometimes for validating victims who come to us for assistance. So you can use volunteer agencies, faith-based organizations, business and victim advocacy groups. Having good technology partners is key. I remember when we started this and when we did the Pulse nightclub shooting, all of those applications were on paper. And it can really become unwieldy, particularly if you've got a large universe of people you're responding to. But with good technology partners, it can help your communications. It can also help just your tracking and applications from victims. And starting with Las Vegas and ever since, all of our applications for assistance have been paperless and online, and it has been much easier to manage. You want to work with local law firms or your local bar association because there are often legal needs for victims that are arising out of this. And oftentimes the pro bono efforts of your local legal community will be tremendously beneficial. I remember in the aftermath of Pulse, The Orange County Bar Association was very helpful, and whatever we needed and asked for, there were 10 people lining up to try and help. You also, if you can work with or identify financial managers and planners, that's going to be an important part too. Sometimes in these funds, victims are given large amounts of money, and they want to, you want to make sure that they're protected and that they are empowered to make a decision about what they want to do with those funds and how they're going to use that to secure their future, and working with professional financial managers and planners is really important. And of course, being integrated with victim service agencies and other community-based and civic organizations are key. For instance, when we helped respond to the Atlanta spa shootings, one of the key responders was Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Because of the demographics of the group that was impacted, that was a group that victims and survivors trusted, and they sort of just fell into this role. And so they already had those relationships. And so we did all that we could to support them. And so every situation's different. And so you want to be open to where are those services going to come from in your community. So when you're initially trying to set up some tasks for donation management, the first thing you want to do is decide how you're going to decide your allocation. It doesn't mean that you have to decide ahead of time how those funds will be allocated and set up a formula, but you should at least decide the process that you're going to use to make those decisions. Because a predetermination may not fit the needs of your current circumstances. If you say ahead of time that you're going to have a fund that's going to dedicate 60% of the donations to those killed and 30% to those injured, what if you only have 2 people killed and 40 injured? Does that allocation make sense? Does that formula still make sense if you have 10 people killed and only 1 injured? So you don't have to set firm guidelines ahead of time, but rather think of a process on how you're going to make those decisions. Also, you want to be aware of what the current statutes and rules are for providing money to people. If you're giving money to a child, whether that child is a direct victim because they were injured or traumatized in an event, or whether they are a surviving family member of someone who was killed, every state has a Uniform Transfer to Minors Act, which governs giving large amounts of money to a minor. But the age that is impacted varies from state to state, and the amount of money that might trigger that rule could vary from state to state. So you want to be aware of that so you know whether or not you're expected for those funds to be paid into a trust that's held for the minor, or if it's sufficient just to put it into a custodial bank account. If you have a victim who is on Medicaid, you have to ask the question of whether giving them a large sum of money is going to invalidate their health insurance. Now, we weren't involved in the Boston One Fund that responded to the Boston Marathon bombing, but I read in the newspaper about a survivor who had lost a limb, and he had a prosthesis, and he had received a check for $250,000 from the Boston One Fund, but that check was sitting in his kitchen drawer because he was afraid that he couldn't cash it or he would lose his state-based, income-based health insurance. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can set up special needs trusts for victims that allow them to receive that money and use it for their care and support without invalidating their eligibility for those types of benefits. Sometimes a community will say, we want to help the first responders too that were dealing with this mass casualty event. But one thing you might want to look into is whether there's a local ordinance that prohibits public employees from receiving private remuneration related to their official duties. In one of our first funds, the mayor wanted to make sure we included first responders, and we were happy to do that. But then we found out after the fact it actually required a resolution by the city council to waive an existing ordinance in order for them to be able to receive those gifts. So those are all things that you want to think about ahead of time. So also among the initial planning tasks for the donation management committee is you want to coordinate and determine when to activate and implement a plan. What is going to be a qualifying event that's going to allow you to open up a fund? Because if you don't have criteria, you're going to have to answer questions about why you're setting up a fund in some cases and not in others. You also think about what your capacity is. How many events can you respond to at once? When we were creating the Compassion Fund, we imagined that we could see a time when there might be 3 different funds overlapping. Yet just this spring, we had as many as 6 funds going at one time. Sometimes an event will happen and we'll set up a fund, and then within that same community, another event will happen and people will be asking, well, are you going to do something for this? And so you really want to think about what your capacity is and what is going to meet the criteria that you're going to set to actually activate one of these plans. And as we talk about developing a communications and social media plan, one of the important things to remember is that 80% of the press releases and talking points and other communications can be prepared ahead of time. Most of this can be drafted with just about 20% of it left open to fill in the blanks that are unique and specific to that event. It's a good time to think about using appropriate language, which words you're going to use, about what the specific needs are. When we've all heard situations where there's been an event and the people at the scene are inundated with donations of goods, whether it's water or clothing or something, which is not what is needed in that instance. And so it's important, can you think ahead of time about the types of events and what type of donations might you be in need of so that you can be prepared to put out that call and ask for that. And it's always good to know that money is fungible. And so it's something that's, relatively easy to collect, that doesn't have to be stored, that doesn't go bad, and that can be used also to purchase sometimes some of the other specific goods that you might need. And again, as I pointed out earlier, there can be multiple legitimate needs arising from an incident. So plan how you're going to direct people to the appropriate location to provide the type of help that they're interested in. I think it's also important to know that in order to communicate with victims, you need to build a contact list because law enforcement and victim services can't release the victim contact information to you. And so if you are not part of law enforcement or victim services, you might only see what you read in the newspaper, and usually they will publicly release the names of those who were killed. There might be some identification of people who were injured or hospitalized if you read different articles, but you want to make sure that no one's left out of your response. And so it's important to create a contact list where victims and survivors who are interested in the relief effort or looking for help or information can sign up and self-identify so that you can do that outreach and provide that information to them. Monetary donations that are made in response to a mass casualty event should be addressed in the emergency management plan just like goods. You want to consider the existing sources of support and where you can fill unmet needs. For instance, We responded to a high school shooting in Texas, and there was a football player that wanted to donate $10,000 to each family to pay for funerals. There's always someone who comes forward and wants to pay for funerals. But if you work in victim services, you know that funeral services is something that's regularly covered by crime victim compensation. And crime victim comp is a payer of last resort. And so if they pay for that, and then someone gets money specifically for that, then there's going to be an offset. So we always try to tell people, don't target your donation for something specific unless we know it's a need that isn't met or addressed by some other existing source of revenue. For instance, crime victim compensation generally only deals with economic loss and not non-economic damages or psychological trauma. So we usually focus on that because then people aren't double dipping and there's not overlap between those systems. Also, think about provisions for long-term community needs. We know that the traumatic impact of one of these events can go on for years, and think about what the community needs to do to be able to build that resiliency over the long term. And you want to be detailed with your plan and think about how you will define who is eligible and who isn't. And you really want to have objective standards because you don't want to have anybody put in a position where they sort of have to make a judgment call on whether or not someone should get help. It opens it up to allegations of bias, whether implicit or explicit. And so having generalized objective standards will help protect you in that regard. When you want to identify an agency or organization to manage, collect, track, and acknowledge and disperse funds, you want to think about, try and find someone who has experience doing that. Preferably, that agency who is receiving donations should be a 501c3 so that the donors can receive a charitable deduction on their taxes. That might be an incentive for some people to give. And so making sure it's a 501c3 helps in that regard, but it also helps ensure that there are some sets of transparency and accountability for 501c3s. It's different in every state, but I know some states have very specific reporting requirements for their nonprofit organizations. And not every nonprofit is going to be set up to do this. Oftentimes, we work with community foundations because community foundations tell us, we're a 501c3, but we can't give money to individuals. We can give money to groups, but we can give money to you as a 501c3, and you're set up to make those distributions to individual victims. And so it's just a question of figuring out who has the ability to do that, and to make sure that they establish those policies and procedures ahead of time to be able to manage the funds and to create a process for dealing with specific donor requests or restricted funds, things like that. And you want to make sure that you coordinate and communicate with the public information officer in your community and with key partners to provide consistent messaging. We've seen inconsistent messaging that's really caused problems in some funds with things that happened in the very early days. And it's also so that everybody is, it's easy to find. You want to create a web-based portal to sort of track, acknowledge, and disperse those donated funds. I know as we first started administering funds, we would get calls from the media like every other day. How much money do you have now? How much money's been donated now? And so one solution that we found is we work with GoFundMe a lot. And if we run those donations through GoFundMe, GoFundMe has an automatic tracker. And if donations that are made offline, because the fee you can't avoid is a credit card processing fee, and if someone's making a donation of $5,000 or more, we encourage them to pay by check or wire transfer. But if they pay offline, we can still send that information, acknowledge that in the tracker. And then it's a really transparent way to tell the world and the media and anybody else how much money has been donated to this fund. And so that's just an existing tool that's free that we take advantage of. As I said, it's really important to coordinate with VOCA and crime victim compensation administrators. We always reach out to them and say, this is what we're doing. This is what we're covering and what it's based on. How are you going to treat this? Are you going to consider this as a collateral benefit? And some states like Texas say, well, charitable donations are not considered a collateral benefit. In other places, it's not counted because we're not basing our gift to a victim on the economic loss they suffered, which was the basis of the compensation from the commission. And so usually when we explain that, they're like, great, thank you for understanding that. Because in my experience, crime victim compensation administrators don't want to count things as a collateral source, but oftentimes they're required to. So if you work in collaboration with them, you can work through that. And I say, this is the way we're doing it. You tell me how you want that communicated. Do you want it written into the protocols? Do you want a press release? Do you want a letter? So that you know this is what we're doing and we can work together. And we want to help victims leverage all available services. Also, you want to think about partnerships with local law firms or legal service agencies, because a lot of survivors have legal needs directly related to fund benefits, whether they need a special needs trust set up because they receive Medicaid, or they are a minor that needs a trust, or maybe there are a child has been orphaned and there are guardianship issues for grandparents who are now taking custody of this child. And so it's really important to make sure you have that legal assistance and expertise. So preventing fraud is critical. One of the reasons that we created the National Compassion Fund was because previously it was pretty common for someone to put up a victim's picture online and say, this is my nephew or this is my cousin, please send money. And they actually had nothing to do with it and they were just robbing people. And so you want to be aware of that. Now, and there are multiple crowdsourcing platforms. As I mentioned, we do a lot of work with GoFundMe. And so if you set up an individual GoFundMe, help pay Krista's medical bills, then that money can go to Krista as an individual. If you set up a GoFundMe that is help victims of the Las Vegas shooting, an undefined group, then GoFundMe requires that money to go to a 501c3 nonprofit. But we have certainly seen instances where on other platforms where people have actually used the name of the Compassion Fund to try and set up fundraising appeals. And so you have to be very wary of that. And so one of the things to do in terms of consumer protection, because you don't want donors being scammed, and you also want to make sure that if people want to give money to support victims and survivors, that it goes to those victims and survivors and to not anyone else. So it might be a good idea if you have a plan in place and that there's going to be a designated fund in your community to consider having the head of local government indicate that this is the trusted place to give. And so that's important to remember. And if there's one place, it makes it a lot easier for others rather than for victims having to navigate multiple funds that are helping with different issues.
So Jeff has spoken a lot about crime victim compensation. So I just want to take a minute to explain that to everyone, just in case you're not familiar with it. So crime victim compensation are state and federal dollars, but they actually come from fines that are paid by defendants, people who have been convicted of a crime. So it's part of the court fines that go to a fund that is administered in states. So there are 2 states that have what they call decentralized, so that every county has its own crime victim compensation fund, but most states just have one. And it's usually out of maybe a division of criminal justice or a governor's office, sometimes attorney general's offices. But it's very easy to find with a really quick Google search in your state to find out where crime victim compensation comes from. But crime victim compensation is, what's important to know is that it's a payer of last resort, and it pays for out-of-pocket expenses for crime victims that have expenses as a result of a particular crime. And there's state statutes that govern what is covered. And then there are some states that will have even policies that will define it even further as to what will be covered, and more importantly, what will not be covered. And so it's important to know in your state not only what the statute is, but maybe what the particular policies might be related to what's covered and what isn't. Now, as we said, that is a payer of last resort, so that means that that any other type of other sources like Medicaid, health insurance, workers' comp, et cetera, have to be accessed prior to applying for crime victim comp. But for victims and survivors of mass violence and terrorism, that they will be eligible for crime victim compensation, but it's again going back to how are victims defined, which is what Jeff was talking about before. So state statute for crime victim compensation and their state policies are going to clarify that a little bit more. So there might be part of the victim pool that might not be eligible for crime victim compensation, but could be eligible and to be defined as a victim for the donated fund. So it's important to be working with a crime victim compensation administrator to know how they define victim. And Jeff was talking before also about kind of collateral sources. And this is important because with crime victim compensation, that every state, they have what's called subrogation. And that means that if a victim receives crime victim compensation dollars and they maybe receive restitution that covers what they've been paid for in crime victim compensation, restitution will be coming from the offender. Or if they win awarded money from a civil lawsuit, or some other source, not donated funds. I want to clarify that they have to, that money is subrogated, so they have to pay back to the crime victim compensation fund. What's important related to these donated funds is that should not be considered. That would not be money that would have to be subrogated if it is not specifically designated for something. So when Jeff was talking about the GoFundMe page, that, when people are saying that we are raising money for funeral expenses, well, if they say that, then crime victim compensation will not cover their funeral expenses. And so with looking at these donated funds, and this goes to when Jeff was talking about communication and the messaging that goes out early, is if it's not anything that's specific to what the victims will use the money for, then they can use it for anything technically. And so that means that it wouldn't qualify then as something that would need to be subrogated and be paid back to crime victim compensation. So it's important when you're putting together your plan that you talk about that messaging and coordinate with crime victim compensation, just because it will really help you identify what maybe there'll be some unmet needs for victims, because crime victim compensation doesn't cover everything. As Jeff had mentioned before, they will cover some mental health support, but there might be limitations to that as far as a financial cap to that. Also, even with medical expenses, that there might be a cap to that. So you might have somebody that has hundreds of thousands of dollars of medical expenses, but crime victim compensation in that state will only pay for $10,000 of that. So that's where the donated dollars can really be helpful.
And I would just point out here, Krista, it's one of the reasons why the source of these funds are fundamentally different and should be treated as such. So there are a lot of different ways that crime victims can get compensation: through state crime victim comp, through restitution, through civil lawsuits, through workers' compensation, and they have a legal right to those things. And oftentimes there is a process in those systems to determine what their actual individual loss is. And victims absolutely have a right to that. Money that is charity, that's a gift, can be treated differently. And we don't want to have that take away from those other resources. And also why, I've been in situations where there was an offender who had a large amount of money, and some people were saying, well, it should go in the victims fund. I don't want that as a charitable donation. That is something that victims have a right to as a matter of law. And there's a way to figure out who gets what out of that. And so we don't want to mix those different ways that these funds are administered and allocated to victims. It's really important to keep them separate. So, as we're talking about how do you distribute those funds, you can do an equitable distribution, which eliminates the need for individual assessment, which can be expensive and labor intensive to figure out what is each victim's individual loss and what are we going to cover. Also, if you remember, after 9/11, when the federal government set up a victim compensation program, as long as victims waived their right to file a lawsuit against the airlines, the government would pay their damages. And so it would pay their economic loss, which included their future economic loss. And so the loss of future income could be different for different people. The future lost income for a stockbroker at Cantor Fitzgerald was going to be very different from the lost future income for a dishwasher at Windows on the World. And as a result, there were a lot of allegations that they were saying that one person's life was worth more than another's, which is not what they were saying. They were just replacing expected future income. But because there was a real distinction in the funds that were given to each victim's family, there were questions of equity brought up. So if you do an equitable distribution and say that all of the families of the deceased are going to get the same amount of money, then that appears fair and transparent, and which might be appropriate for money that is donated and is charity versus money that comes from something that someone has a legal right to. You also want to think about what are those community needs that will continue, to make sure that you are transparent and communicate what's going on, that you use licensed professionals wherever possible, and recognize that, all of the attention and media attention and money that goes to victims of a mass casualty event can sometimes make other victims of crime feel marginalized. I've always said, as a survivor, that every victim of a crime goes through their own personal 9/11 and they suffer the impact of that. But not every victim has the benefit of a celebrity-filled concert for their benefit. And so we really have to think about that. But oftentimes I've said, after a mass casualty crime, the money comes in almost spontaneously. After Sandy Hook, nobody was asking for money, but money just started flowing in to that town. And I thought, if victims of a mass casualty crime who have suffered this trauma in the public eye, they've already been through this. If people are going to give money anyway, can't we at least create a process that is victim-centered and trauma-informed to help them? In terms of actually distributing the funds, you want to make sure that primary agency is going to develop strategies for the allocation of funds, and I'll be able to give some examples a little later about some of the ways that we do it. Determine who has authority over the donation of funds. We usually work with a local steering committee that sets policy for eligibility and and determines the distribution of those funds. But it's always important to make sure that you include victim advocates or other folks that are navigators that can help people through this process, and to really coordinate with victims and their families. You want to know what their situation is. I have seen, when a mass casualty crime happens, we're dealing with people, and it can be a cross section of our entire population. And I've seen every different family dynamic that you can imagine, and you want to be responsive to what those people's situations are. And so as you develop a policy or eligibility standards in relation to a specific event, you want to think about who are the people that were impacted by that. So for instance, at the Pulse nightclub, that was a victim population that was largely LGBTQ and Hispanic. And so it was important that on that steering committee that there was representation from those communities. When we responded to the Walmart shooting in El Paso, that happened on a Saturday morning, there were lots of elderly people that were doing their Saturday morning shopping. And so we had to recognize that and think about that as we're responding to this event, and the types of services we're providing and how we're interacting with those survivors. So you always want to make sure you have a victim-centered approach, and that means considering who your victims are of this particular event. It's really important to provide notification to victims regarding the allocation of funds, and creating protocols for victims, and so that you can get feedback on them. You want to talk about how are people's dissatisfaction or disagreement with fund allocation going to be handled. You want to identify some strategies for addressing that conflict, and really keep victims informed. And as I'll talk about, we usually put out a proposed set of rules and have an opportunity for people to give feedback and or make additional suggestions. And sometimes we've had really good suggestions that have been actually incorporated into those final protocols. And so not only did we give agency to those people, that their voice was heard and that they could influence this process, but it showed that we were running a transparent process as well. Oftentimes, people ask, well, how did you end up doing this? And I'm a homicide survivor, and I've been involved in victims' rights since 1994. And in 1998, when I started working with the National Center for Victims of Crime, where I ran their National Crime Victim Bar Association, I became an authority on the financial damages that victims suffered and how those victims are compensated through restitution, victim compensation, and civil lawsuits. And after 9/11, when Congress created that victim compensation program, but required applicants to waive their right to file a civil lawsuit, NCVC did 27 forums around the country, every place, every borough of New York, every place a plane was going, every place a plane was coming from, any place we could find pockets of survivors. And we did a forum to explain to them, this is what happens under the fund. This is what happens under a lawsuit. How do you decide which one is right for you? And that experience really informed our work. And in 2012, we were approached by survivors of the Aurora Theater shooting. And they said, we don't like how our fund is being administered, and we want you to set up a different fund for us. So I thought, well, rather than just set up a fund for you, what if we put an infrastructure in place so that when one of these events occurs, we can flip a switch, we can start accepting contributions from the general public, and we can make sure that 100% of that money goes to the victims of that crime. And so that's what we did. And we built that infrastructure. And we just waited for the day to come that we knew would happen, even though we didn't want it to. And that happened on April 2nd, 2014, with the second mass shooting in Fort Hood. And the Defense Department designated us as their official relief fund. And that was our beta test. We got some donations, we gave it to victims, and we learned that fundamentally this process could work. And since then, we have done 20 different funds, large and small, including the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, the Harvest Festival shooting in Las Vegas, shooting at Santa Fe High School in Santa Fe, Texas in 2018, and or the fund for the Walmart shooting in El Paso in 2019. So between 2014 and 2020, we have collected and distributed over $102 million to more than 3,000 victims of mass casualty crimes. And the key principles in this approach is to have a trauma-informed approach, to make sure that the approach is community-led, that it's holistic and victim-centered, and that we always honor donor intent. And I'll explore each of these in turn. So to have a trauma-informed process, we recognize trauma, and we want others to understand that psychological trauma is real and devastating. And so we see that as part of our mission. And in fact, one of the reasons survivors of the Aurora Theater shooting came to us was because they weren't happy that if under the initial fund, if you were not physically injured, you didn't qualify. And there were people whose loved ones died in their arms or died protecting them. And they could not abide someone saying that they didn't count as a victim. And so we make a point of including categories of psychological trauma in addition to death and injury. To show that, you know, these are the groups, the major groups of people that are impacted, and in an effort not to leave anyone else. We want to have as survivor-friendly an approach as possible that meets victims where they are. Sometimes people say that our process takes too long, like you've got to get people money faster. But other times we hear from victims that I'm not ready to deal with this right now, and I can't deal with administrative stuff in the aftermath of this trauma. And so we're trying to strike that balance and help people as soon as we can, but when victims and survivors are ready to interact with us. And we also do personal case management for death and injury whenever possible. And sometimes it's based on our capacity. So for instance, with the Las Vegas shooting, where 59 people were killed, we were able to do individual outreach to families of those who were killed. We would reach out to them, let them know who we were, what the process was, that we were here to help them, get some information about their family situation, try and identify special needs cases as far in advance as possible. But we just didn't have the capacity to do the outreach for injuries as well. When we did the Stoneman Douglas high school shooting in Parkland, Florida, there were 17 killed and about 18 or 20 injured. And so with those numbers, we could do outreach to both the families of those who were killed and people who were wounded as well. But trying to do that personal case management makes a difference to try and have a trauma-informed process. Next slide. It's also important that this process is community-led. We have expertise to administer a fund, but the local steering committee that we work with really needs to make those policy decisions. It is important that the policy decisions are informed by the local experience and local sensibilities and local values. And so we work with that local steering committee that's oftentimes made up of civic and community and business leaders that are a diverse representation of the community that we're serving. And we always propose a set of draft protocols and seek public comment on those protocols before finalizing. And after we distribute funds to victims, we have an independent financial review to show where they look at our financial records and our bank accounts and show that how much money was donated for this fund and how much money was dispersed for this fund, so that people can see that those numbers match to the penny, so that we have been true to our word that 100% of the donated funds would go to victims of the event. It's also important that this fund be holistic and victim-centered. So that's why we collaborate with existing victim services, so that we can share information and be good traffic cops, so that anytime someone comes to us, if it's not something that we are responsible for or can help with, then we can at least refer them to the people that are dealing with that. And that way we can work together. And it's important to keep all of the providers that are responding to an event like this informed and in close communication. And that's why we work in conjunction with state crime victim compensation. We also make sure that, we build these special needs trusts, so that, and having trusts for minors, so that we make things easier for victims and not harder, and so that those funds are protected. And it's really important to honor donor intent. And Krista, why don't you go ahead and talk about this?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about it. When we talk about donor intent here, and Jeff had mentioned this a little bit earlier, that when people are donating, they have an idea of where they want that money to go, that they are looking at it to go maybe to the victims directly. But as was stated earlier, that there are a lot of corporations that also make donations. And so they might not be as specific as to where they want the money to go because they don't know really what the needs are. And so that's really an opportunity to be a little bit more broad with where the funds can go, and really looking at how those categories of victimization, as was mentioned earlier, because really traumatized people will complain if they feel left out, understandably. I mean, that's not being very trauma informed. But it's, again, looking at how do you define victims and how far reaching are you going to go, that you can look at a community is certainly impacted, because when we started talking about community trauma, but are they all really victims? And really there probably wouldn't be enough money to be distributed to them either. But it's important, though, that to relay that information to the community, that when donations were given, that their intent was for it to go directly to victims that were primarily impacted, and in the different categories of psychological, physical, as well as families of the deceased, but also maybe to some services that are being provided to victims as well. Because oftentimes people don't think about that, because the money really needs to go to those that are in need. And sometimes the best place for that can be to the service agencies that are providing those services. It's important, though, to recognize that offenders and offenders' families are not eligible for these donated funds. That would not be the intent of any donor. And also, when you're talking to corporations, looking in your community and trying to identify who are the key businesses and corporations in your community that, if an incident were to occur, that would most likely donate, and to go to them ahead of time and say, here's what we know about incidents of mass violence and what the needs would be. And we know that some of those can that can be by direct disbursement to victims through our fund, but there might be some that might be better through particular services, whether it's behavioral health services, victim advocacy, et cetera, and asking them, would they be okay if some of their money went to services as opposed to directly to the victims? Because and that would certainly be honoring the intent if they would be all right with that. And that goes into the issue of talking about administrative costs, because it takes resources to manage this money and the resources. It takes staff time. And so how's that going to be paid for? Well, the individual person who's writing their check for $50, they certainly don't want any of their money to be put towards administrative dollars. But this is where some of your larger donors can help cover that if they're asked ahead of time to say, hey, would you mind if a particular percentage of the money went to cover some of the administrative overhead expenses? And again, most large donors are going to be fine with that because they understand about administrative costs. And that way, then the individual donor can be assured that their money is going, directly to the victims. And also looking that there might be a need for maybe some longer term needs. So having some money set in reserve. I'll give you an example, the Boston Marathon, that there were a lot of people that suffered from hearing impairment, but it wasn't identified immediately when the money was being dispersed because they lost their hearing slowly. And then 12 months later, they have hearing losses, but most of the money had been already expended related to helping them with any of their medical costs. So what Boston did though with their fund was that they did have some money set in reserve to meet those longer term needs. So that is something to consider as well. And Jeff, do you want to talk about the importance of language?
Sure. And I think that, this is where we said that language matters, and how you're defining people. And this could be where whether you're talking about helping victims or survivors, because people have very different ideas of who a victim is. And if you can at least make that clear from the beginning, your job's going to be a lot easier. So let's talk about how we determine eligibility. When we start, it's usually by drawing a circle on a map and saying people who are inside this circle are covered and people outside the circle are not. And it's an arbitrary decision, but we sort of make it in relation to that event. So for example, in the Pulse nightclub, if you were inside the club or on its patio, you were covered. You were included and eligible. But if you were in the parking lot or across the street, you weren't. Here, this is a diagram of the Walmart in El Paso, and where the pin is on the map is the Walmart. Next door is the Sam's Club, and they actually share a parking lot. There were victims who were actually shot in the parking lot. And so we had to include the parking lot. There were people who were injured and bleeding and were brought into Sam's Club for safety. And so the steering committee made the decision that the physical scope of eligibility would include the Sam's Club, the Walmart, and the parking lot in between. But Landry Seafood House next door, if you were there, that was considered too remote. And if you were present there, you weren't covered. It's important that we, how you define victim for eligibility, because there are different definitions. There's a legal definition for prosecution purposes. There might be a different definition of victim for crime victim compensation or for the application of a state victims' rights amendment. And you also want to think about the difference between grief and trauma. Trauma is a psychological response that happens when someone's life and safety is threatened. If a close family member dies, but the person was not present at the time, they'll be suffering from grief, but someone who was there, and if it happened in front of them, that person could be suffering from trauma. And so sometimes we have to make those distinctions for folks to understand those differences, because we certainly don't have enough resources to help and consider every grieving family member and friend of someone who is killed to be a direct victim of an event like this. And so usually we look to surviving family members, and for guidance, we often look to the state statute for what happens to someone's things when they die without a will, because it will identify in a certain order of priority who those close family members are. Is it a spouse? Is it children? Is it surviving parents? And so we use that to determine that eligibility. And because these are charitable funds, you can really make your own rules and tailor it to the decision, tailor your decision to the circumstances at hand, but you just want to decide ahead of time, how is that decision going to be made? And so these are generally our categories of eligibility: families of the deceased, people who suffered a physical injury. Though based on the event, the steering committee will determine what counts as a physical injury. Are we talking about just people who get shot? Or are we talking about people who blow out their knee running for their life? And also in this last category, sometimes we call it presence, because an event might be so overwhelming that anybody who is present within that circle of eligibility is definitely going to be impacted, like the Pulse nightclub. I saw statements from every single person who submitted an application, and I can tell you, regardless of whether someone was physically injured, no one got out of that club without being severely impacted by this event. But we've also done funds where there was a shooting in a 1.2 million square foot warehouse, and there could be someone in the building that didn't even realize what was happening. And so sometimes we use a standard of people who identify that they have experienced psychological trauma as a result of the event. And sometimes we have to do that just based on making sure we have a universe that will have sufficient resources to provide assistance for. And as I mentioned, whenever someone submits an application, and I hate the word application, but I haven't found a better one, because it's not like someone is applying for assistance and we're standing in judgment about whether or not they deserve it. We're really just looking to make sure that we're dealing with the right person, and that is someone who is actually at the event or that they were actually injured. And so we have a validation workflow where once an application submitted, we have a group of paralegals from various law firms that volunteer pro bono to review the forms, make sure they filled out the right form, they attach the right documentation, and then it usually goes on to law enforcement to validate that, yes, this person was present at the crime scene. Sometimes if it is a workplace violence incident or a shooting at a school, the best people to validate presence might be the school system or the employer. So, but oftentimes we use law enforcement, but that could vary based on the situation. If someone was injured, they also submit a HIPAA release of information authorization so that we can go directly to their identified medical provider and just have them validate, yes, this victim was treated for this as a result of this event, and we might be asking them about their nights of hospitalization. We prefer to get that validation directly from the medical provider, because one, we don't want to burden victims with having to collect and submit their medical records, but also when they did the fund for the Boston Marathon bombing, there was someone who submitted very good forged copies of medical records, and they were awarded hundreds of thousands of dollars in benefits, but then ultimately went to jail for fraud. And so to avoid that, we like to validate directly with the medical provider and not just get information from the victim. And then finally, we review all of the eligibility and make sure that if in a death case that we have all the appropriate information for the people that have been designated as heirs that will share in this benefit. And so then at the end of the process, we go back to the steering committee and then we say, this is how many people were validated in each of these categories of eligibility. This is how much money was donated, and have a plan that just carves up 100% of that to those different categories. And then once they approve that distribution plan, we'll just send money directly to the victim or to a trust if it's needed in that case. As I said, we usually will treat beneficiaries within the same category, that they'll have the same level of benefit. So all families of the deceased will receive the same level of benefit, whether someone had 9 children or someone had no children. And the size of the gift is really a factor of the amounts of money that was donated to the fund and how many validated victims we had. We also require beneficiaries of decedents to consent to their share as part of their application process. So if it's a spouse and the spouse is getting everything, that's fine. They say, I know I'm going to get 100% of this. But if there is a spouse, but there are also children from a previous relationship, then it may be that the spouse is going to get half and all of the children will split the other half in remaining in equal shares. And so that means, but we don't, when they do this, we don't know what the level of benefit's going to be. And so they just consent to, I'm going to get this percent of this person's this victim's distribution. And then there's also figuring out how do you actually get money to people. We usually do digital disbursement through Zelle wherever we can. It's our preferred method because we can do direct deposit into someone's account, but it doesn't to require to have their account information. We just need their Zelle identifier, which is usually a mobile phone number or a email address. And we can validate it, we can track it. We don't have to worry about checks getting lost or checks getting 2 weeks or taking 2 weeks or more to get delivered. So where we can, we try to pay people through Zelle. But again, we have people in all sorts of different circumstances and we'll find ways to pay them, whoever they are. Now, we can't give tax advice, but we can pass along information from the IRS. And usually when we do a fund, there is a senator or a member of Congress from that local area who writes a letter to the commissioner of the IRS and says, this terrible mass casualty crime happened in our community and the people are donating money to this fund. Can you please tell me about the taxability of those funds? And we always get a letter that's almost exactly like this, that basically just restates what the existing law is, that these funds are a gift, and a gift is taxable to the giver of the gift, not the recipient of the gift. And since the giver of the gift is a 501c3, we don't pay taxes. And so there's generally no tax implication. But we will get a letter like this from the IRS commissioner. We'll put it on our website. We'll share it with victims and say, give this letter to whoever does your taxes, and they can interpret that as they see fit and how it applies to you. When you're creating a plan, make sure you include all relevant stakeholders and allow for ample time, especially if you're going to be, the goal here is to create a plan before the event happens. And you should give yourself at least 4 to 6 months because, making sure you have all the right stakeholders. When you have a large group of people, getting on their calendar is tough. And then sometimes in between the meetings, you're going to have different subgroups for stakeholders that are in the same area like law enforcement and emergency management or victim services. And you're going to have them in between them and okay, you guys huddle and say, what do you think is the best way to deal with this in your jurisdiction? You know best about what's going to work here. And so it could easily take 6 months or more for that plan to be developed. And so you want to allow enough time to do that. And if we go on to the next slide, where we have worked with communities to create a plan ahead of time, some of the subgroups that we've had as part of the larger committee were emergency management and law enforcement, medical, because if you can get the largest area hospitals to come together ahead of time. We like to use, some hospitals each have their own release of information authorization. We like to get them to agree on a common one because it's easier for victims to get them to understand how we're going to work with them to validate in the event of this. Victim services, whether it is happening through a standalone agency or through law enforcement or through a prosecutor's office, making sure that we're connected with how victim services are being delivered to this population impacted. Mental health. In every community, we have identified huge mental health needs after one of these events. And the common complaint we hear is that we can't find enough mental health providers, or we can't find mental health providers that are specifically trained in this type of trauma. And so think about that ahead of time. And how do you build up your bench of community resources? Having a subcommittee for legal services and compliance so that we can think about ahead of time, what are your state's requirements for the Uniform Transfer to Minors Act or things like that, so you can plan for that ahead of time. Also having a communications committee that can think up things ahead of time, like what are you going to name this fund? You can draft the press releases and talking points. If it is the focus of a community, you can come up with logos and everything ahead of time. The sooner you can respond after the event, the better it's going to be for victims. And also have a working group dedicated to the administration of the fund and also recruiting the steering committee. We always say 80% of the people that you want on that steering committee, you can identify before an event even happens. And so think about those things.